Hi, I'm Amy.
And I'm Kirsty.
And this is our podcast covering the highs, lows, and realities of parenting a child with neurodiversity.
Each week we'll be sharing updates from our lives and hearing from a variety of guests about their advice and experiences.
This is Love Needs No Words.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Love Needs No Words. Today we are joined by Seona, an NHS Speech and Language therapist who works to support communication needs of children typically between the ages of 5 and 16. As part of this, she works closely with schools to offer guidance and advice on how they can best give ongoing support to their students. She also happens to be Max's wonderful auntie, so we are very excited to have her on the podcast today. Hello, Seona.
Hey.
Hi, Seona.
It's very exciting to be on. Yeah.
We've not had a speech and language therapist before, so
fan.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think probably a really good place to start, as I touched on in the introduction, is that you do a lot of work within schools. In fact, most of the work that you do is within schools, kind of supporting teachers and students. So how does speech and language therapy in schools work, and what is the approach that you take?
We deliver training for teaching staff. We can support through parent coffee mornings to support their understanding of what speech and language is, and if they're how they can support speech and language at home. So kind of bridging that gap. We work closely with Senkos to have a look and see what's going really well in school and how communication is being supported, and also where we can then offer that next level of support for them.
Alex actually has a speech and language therapist, so I've know firsthand the benefits of having a speech and language therapist, but also sort of that early intervention, sort of getting somebody on board as early as possible. Do you see a big link with neurodivergency and speech and language? And I guess how does speech and language therapy support those children specifically?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's a lot of ways we support children that are neurodivergent within schools. I mean, they probably make up the majority of our caseload. We might think about language and processing, so supporting understanding in the classroom, supporting how they're kind of expressing themselves as well, so they're able to share that understanding, because that might look quite different to a neurotypical child as well. Thinking about how we're supporting their social communication and how we're advocating for them in more of a neurotypical space, and making sure kind of their social communication is understood and supported within that environment as well, and making kind of those opportunities there for them to be able to kind of engage with their peers, but also for their peers to understand them.
And some of the techniques you use, when Alex uses PEC cards, so do you do things like that and sort of Makaton and that sort of thing? I know you said it's individual to each child, but what are some of the techniques you kind of use?
Yeah, Makaton is something that we really try to advocate for people to use, and is a really good way of kind of supporting that communication. All schools should hopefully have some understanding of Makaton, and it's something that we support them to expand their understanding and use of as well. You mentioned PECs as well, so we use probably a bit more of a broader term to describe that, so we call it AAC, which stands for alternative and augmentative communication, and that might be when you use different communication systems. So you might have a high-tech AAC device which you can use to create sentences and generate speech from using kind of different apps on a device. Or you might have kind of a lower tech AAC where you have kind of visuals, it might be like a core board, and you use that to communicate instead. So I think that's probably what you see Alex using a little bit more, where he kind of has those visuals which he's kind of sharing what he wants to say or kind of communicate with you. So yeah, that's also something that we do.
And it has a massive benefit, doesn't it, on children that are non-speaking. So for Alex with his PEC cards, they have a singing lesson every week. And so they use his PEC book for him to choose which song they sing. So using those techniques, they can really feel part of a classroom when otherwise they might feel really isolated. Do you find that through the techniques you use, you see massive benefits for children, especially those non-speaking?
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely really important to create a system which they're able to share what they want to share. Like being able to have that choice and be able to share that is just makes them have, such a better experience with it, and how regulating it must feel when you're able to share that with someone. So yeah, just being able to kind of choose what you want, if whether that's through visual cards or whether it's through kind of an object, or whether you're kind of able to write that might look different for everyone. But yeah, no, it's definitely really, really supportive.
One of the things you mentioned is about supporting children who are in a kind of more neurotypical environment. So
Yeah,
both Alex and Max are in mainstream school. So
yeah.
yeah, that's a sort of neurotypical environment that they're kind of having to operate in on a daily basis. What do you find are some of the challenges that you see with the students that you work with? What are they facing in school when it comes to communication? Because I know you work predominantly in mainstream, at least in the younger years.
Yeah, the difficulty is that awareness sometimes, and that's not necessarily the fault of either party, necessarily either like the people that are supporting or the individual themselves. It's just kind of that breakdown in understanding of both parties and what's going on for them. And I think that's a bit of a journey, really, isn't it? Because you don't start school and become suddenly aware that you need all these strategies in place. It's a learning curve, and it takes people using strategies consistently, and trying to kind of find out what works
Mm.
within the different environments, and building that rapport with individuals to make that an easier journey for them.
Yeah, and I suppose as a parent, often you obviously know your child the best, but for a school,
Yeah,
it must be really difficult because you said yourself, like every single child is different. Every
yeah,
child responds differently to different techniques and different strategies, and what they need is, varied. That must be really hard for schools sometimes to
yeah,
know what strategy to put in place for what child without it kind of being well, we've got to just try some stuff and see whether it works,
yeah,
which can feel quite frustrating, I would imagine, for A, the student, and B, probably the parents as well at times, because they
Mhm.
probably feel like, oh, come on, like there needs to be more done. But yeah, obviously when the child is struggling to say what they need, and that's obviously why you're there a lot of the time,
yeah,
it's partly a bit of a guessing game maybe, until you
yeah.
find those strategies that work, and then they change sometimes, and
Yeah,
the
exactly.
approach needs to
And
change.
you've found some strategies that work, and then something else happens, and you then need to adapt it. But I think we can only do as much as we can do based on what we know. So I think it's that continuous learning curve of whether you work directly with an individual, or whether you're kind of more broadly just supporting with understanding different conditions that you might come across within the mainstream classroom, and how things are being adapted to support that. I think we all play a part, and we can only do as well as we know at the time. So yeah,
I think a massive issue that we've got, and I don't know if it's in your area, but especially here, is that the waiting lists are so long to get speech and language therapists. So we're lucky enough to pay privately each week. I don't know what would have happened if we hadn't had that opportunity, because we have only been given sort of speech and language therapists through the NHS in the last year. So I think Alex would have been very frustrated, very angry, I can imagine, because those interventions weren't in place. So for many people listening, I think hearing what you say, having those techniques in classrooms really early on is so beneficial. Have you found that where you are, that the waiting times are so long, and must be frustrating for you as well, because you know how important it is to get in there as soon as possible?
I think early years might look slightly different, and I don't work directly in early years, and it might look slightly different,
Mm.
based on where we are. But I know that across the UK, waiting times is something that's a real difficulty for speech and language therapy services at the moment. And as you say, it impacts then when the intervention can start.
Yeah.
And I think the biggest difficulty is then if we're not able to set things up from when they're going into school, and having that kind of continuously, it does push kind of some issues along, I guess.
Mm.
But yeah, that's kind of why we try quite hard to implement strategies at the universal level just to increase that understanding and ability to adapt things for individuals when they do come into school, because it reduces that pressure on one individual to have to be kind of that key to creating any difference for that child. You know, if we're able to deliver training to, you know, a whole staff team, and then able to then implement communication supportive strategies every day when they're engaging with that child every single day, that's where, you know, we'll see the difference being made. I mean, there's not a possibility for speech and language therapy to be given every single day to every child, and actually probably no need for us to deliver that. It's better to come from people that have a really good rapport and are delivering, you know, lessons and, you know, interventions, and they're at playtime, they're at meal times, to be able to use those strategies, you know, through doing that and upskilling everyone in the environment and just supporting everyone to create that communication friendly place. It helps with that and reduces that pressure. And I think also reassures parents, because I know that I mean, I'm not a parent, but if I was and I was sat there waiting and just felt like nothing was being done, it would be incredibly stressful. And I think if, you know, we're able to offer support before that point, then it's beneficial for everyone, because, you know, parents feel empowered, schools feel more empowered, we're able to access more children. We're, you know, reducing potentially that need for them to come even onto our specialist caseload, and then that frees up all sorts of time for us to then, you know, be implementing potentially more for those children that are more complex and do need more support from us, but also making sure that we're not kind of like missing anyone that, you know, wouldn't be able to necessarily receive specialist support from us.
That's a really interesting point that you made, because I hadn't really thought about that, I don't think, much before. So Max doesn't get speech and language therapy. He was assessed by the speech and language team as part of his EHCP needs assessment, but he was discharged from them. But actually, there are points of the day and where he really struggles to be able to communicate, especially where he's got like overstimulated or he's just kind of dysregulated. And actually knowing that the teachers and the Senkos and the staff body, are, you know, have those tools and techniques to be able to support him, because realistically a speech and language therapist isn't going to be there.
Yeah, and also it's like kind of one of those, it's like, are we even in that moment best placed to be with a child if they're emotionally dysregulated and actually they don't know us massively well?
Yeah.
Is it better for them to be with an adult which they do have a really good relationship with, really good rapport with, and they're able to use strategies to support that regulation?
Have you seen a massive increase of children sort of with issues with speech since COVID? I know it was something that was mentioned, but I don't know if you've seen that.
Yeah, I mean, I think from the studies that are out there, they think that there has been an increase in that. And I think for us, how working in education, it's kind of all impacted on kind of how they're able to potentially access some of that education as well, because their education's looked quite different. So there's quite a few things to unpick, whether it's kind of, is it a speech and language need? Is it just that they have missed quite a big chunk of their education, and they've also lived through something quite not necessarily traumatic, but having a disjointed relationship with education, for sure, like being educated at home for a few years, where that's going to look different for everyone, you know. So yeah, it's definitely will have had an impact and has impacts in the broad, but it's interesting to try and unpick like which areas it's impacted the most, to be honest, and why.
This is something you might not know the answer to, Seona, but I'll ask you anyway. Do you know why there's some autistic children that suddenly just start talking? I've heard like situations where they start speaking in full sentences or with an American accent. So do you know why that just suddenly happens?
That's to do with the echolalia. So echolalia, you might have heard of like two different types of echolalia. There's kind of immediate echolalia, which is where a child will kind of just repeat exactly what you've said, or a little bit of what you've said back to you in that exact moment. So they might use it as a way to regulate, as a way to take a turn, as a way to kind of process what you've said before kind of responding to it, just so they have that time to have a think about what they might say. Delayed echolalia is when a child will use phrases or words or parts of kind of like a whole string of sometimes unintelligible sounds or little bits of jargon they might have heard from something that is particularly motivating for them, because you can be neurotypical and learn language through delayed echolalia as well, but for the most part, they are called like analytical language learners. And that's where you learn like single words and then you put them together and then you kind of like build them up from that. So it's like an upside down triangle almost. Whereas for delayed echolalia, it's the other way around. So they start with like the big chunks of language and then have picked that up from something that they find motivating. I hear a lot of like people say that their children picked up from like Peppa Pig, but also from like pick up the intonation of kind of like a whole song and be able to kind of like sing it back to you. But they might not necessarily have broken that down yet into single words. So that's where I think I tend to hear people like, oh, they just started speaking in full sentences, and I'm like, delayed echolalia there. And that's, I think people used to think it wasn't massively functional for a while, and the opinion on that has changed a lot. Like we always like really encourage like acknowledgement, acceptance, and just trying to find out what they're trying to communicate to us through whatever their like chunks of language they're using, because it can be really helpful and it's really regulating a lot of the time for children that use that type of language.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I guess it's them just sort of storing all that language up for so long that then all of a sudden it just sort of starts to come out.
And I wonder what it is specifically that causes that kind of switch for them to think, actually, okay, now I'll use that.
I mean, there's different ways that people feel more confident with communicating, and for some children communicating through gesture and body language, it feels a bit safer for them. So that's why they use that kind of like in the main, and we might hear them kind of like mumbling things to themselves, but they might not quite have that like want to communicate with others in that way. But also a lot of the time, and something that I try and really encourage schools to think about, is kind of that rapport, because sometimes I think at home parents will say, oh, they're using loads of language and it's, you know, amazing and all this, and then school are like, oh, but they never use that here. And I'm like, but what kind of rapport do they have with staff members, and are they feeling confident and connected to someone enough that they're able to kind of then want to use that language? So I think rapport is definitely something that's really important, and also just feeling regulated and just feeling that that's how they want to communicate. It can look quite different in different contexts as well.
Really important thing you said there was sort of like try repeating even sounds they're making, and just repeating it, or even just assuming what it could be. But also, I think there's a massive point in that if you've never spoken before, there must be a confidence thing as well. It's having that confidence to speak after so long. Do you find that as well? You touched on it slightly there.
I guess in like different situations, it feels so different for them. So like at home, they might feel, you know, really safe, and confident probably is like one of the right words, but maybe it's like more that safety of communicating and using that communication with people around you. And as you say, like just repeating back what they're saying, or acknowledging kind of those communication attempts that they're making, and kind of trying to guess what they're trying to communicate with that, and not restricting in any way kind of what they're communicating, really supports that safety and making them feel that kind of their communication attempts are valid. And also kind of just reducing that pressure. So what I always kind of advocate for is like not to prompt a child with speaking. We can kind of try to understand what they're trying to communicate to us, either through kind of choices or kind of like showing them objects or visuals. That's really helpful. But trying to prompt them to say something tends to kind of have the opposite effect of then, that's not actually spontaneous, that's not communication that's coming from them. It's kind of what we're wanting them to say. So yeah, reducing that prompting, kind of giving some of that space and that silence for them to potentially share in whatever way that might be through gesture, body language, some spoken language, but it's just supporting them to feel like their communication is valid as well. So yeah.
Can you give us some of your like top tips that you can give us to help?
Yeah, definitely. Giving them the opportunity to make a choice about something, whether that's even kind of at book time, are they able to share what book they might want, giving them a choice of two, like even if it's a book we know they really enjoy and maybe one that they've not seen before, we know they probably will choose the one that they enjoy, because I mean, why wouldn't you? But just being able to kind of communicate that and have those options there is a really nice way just to be able to share kind of those choices, and kind of even like the easy times like snack time, just giving the choices so they're able to kind of communicate that and pick what snack they might want. And then during play, I think is something that I try to support and suggest, is like really following their lead through play, and within that kind of bringing toys that that they'll enjoy and gravitate towards potentially, but also maybe some toys that you think that they might be interested in but they might not have known about, and potentially reducing some of those distractions around them and giving them an environment where they're able to kind of gravitate towards what they want to play in, and those other options as well, and following their lead with that, and kind of giving them that silence and that space, and hopefully with one other adult just having that quite, we call it kind of like special time where they're following the child's play and giving them silence, but also kind of modeling some language that they might be able to use when playing. So if we notice that they kind of need help, like what we might say in that moment, and giving some narration around what they're doing, and then kind of when they do communicate with us, then kind of giving that, either repeating back what they've said or acknowledging what they've said if you can't quite understand them, and then if you think they're trying to kind of communicate something with us, then maybe repeating back how they might say that if they wanted to, if they had kind of the words to almost.
That's really useful.
That was the question.
Really useful.
Yeah, the play thing's really interesting for me as well. It's kind of a bit of a topic that's come up in the last couple of months with Max as well, because school are trying to support him in his play, because he finds play quite difficult. He finds interacting with other children, like he wants to do it, but he struggles to find the right words, or he kind of wants to do it on his terms, not necessarily on the terms of the other children. So one of the things I was talking about with the Senko was about that they'll play games with him, and they might he'll learn how to play a game on his own, and then they'll start bringing in more people so that he can learn turn taking and that kind of thing. I guess they're things that we can do at home as well, but I guess on the topic of how parents can support children at home, I guess both in terms of like verbal and non-verbal communication, because you've touched on that a lot. Do you have any tips for parents?
Yeah, play is definitely like a really interesting one, and it is interesting because there's always that like motivation sometimes we see when children might want to be able to play with others, and like how do we facilitate that, and making sure that we're reflecting what their interest might be in that play, and then kind of supporting them in a really neurodiversity affirming way to share that with other children. But I think on the flip side of that, maybe a little bit of a tangent, but just supporting others to understand as well like what they might find difficult during play, because I think there's always a bit of a focus on, okay, they're not able to take turns as easily, maybe they want to do it kind of on their terms, and they're still learning what that looks like to do it take turns with other children, or to follow others' lead in play, because they might just prefer to be a bit more autonomous in play. But if they're motivated to have other children there, supporting them, the other child, to kind of understand what that might look like and why. Like, you don't necessarily have to share diagnoses. I know children, when they're quite young, that's something that they don't necessarily know, but just sharing like, they want you to play their game with them, but they struggle a little bit more with turn taking. Do you think we can help with that, and just have that understanding that that's something that might look a bit different for that child, and just, you know, advocating for that child, but also spreading the awareness for other children as well, that their communication style might be a little bit different, or they might need a little bit more support with it as well. But yeah, I always think it's nice to try and increase the awareness of everyone, and it's not just kind of the onus put onto the neurodivergent child, because I think that just is always kind of how it has been, that, you know, they're not fitting into our neurotypical world. What can we do to change it? And actually, we don't want to do that. We want to spread awareness and for everyone to understand that neurodivergence is a thing, it's very valid, and the way that they play is also valid, and to understand that. But yeah, no, in terms of supporting that at home, getting into their world, even if that's kind of for 5-10 minutes a day, just kind of following their lead during play and modeling those techniques around them during that time that they're kind of engaged and motivated by play. So whether if they're kind of expressing that they want to be able to take turns, us modeling that as adults when, you know, we're playing with them, how we might, you know, take a turn with something, or if they, you know, have siblings, how they might then take turns with their siblings as well. And even if they don't necessarily want to do that in a game with us in the moment, maybe if like you were taking turns in another activity, you know, with another family member at some point when you're playing kind of like alongside each other, just modeling those skills around them is still supportive, but it might not be kind of the best moment for them to, you know, have their play and let's go and do turn taking now, because you need to learn how to turn take with someone. That just might not be motivating for them at the moment. But having it modeled around them and kind of making it like an environment that's accepting of their play, and they're seeing that you're supporting some of those things that they want to learn as well, I think is really lovely. But yeah,
I think that's a really important point, because for Alex, although he doesn't speak, he is able to tell me what he wants through cards and things like that. Now, if you weren't giving children that opportunity to show you, that's where obviously the frustration comes in. But we'll sit with our daughter and we'll say, you know, what animal's this? And she can say, well, Alex can still point at what the animal is. So he still can join in. Yes, it's not verbally, but it's still giving him a voice. It's still saying that you're still part of this game. Just because you're not verbal, you're still able to join in. And I think that's what you mean. It's sort of like giving them the opportunity to show you what they can do, which they really do surprise you. They are amazing at how much they know. Yes, it's not verbal, but how much they can communicate if given the opportunity to.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's just supporting to understand that communication looks different for everyone, and the more we're able to kind of tap into how an individual's communication looks like for them, the more we're able to support them to express themselves as well. Exactly as you say, you know, it might be that they're using gesture or body language or taking us to something, but they're still able to kind of share that and communicate that. And actually we all use such different communication forms like all day every day. There's a lot of adults that are either neurodivergent or not, that prefer to speak via messenger, or to, you know, write an email rather than pick up the phone and call someone. And I think sometimes, as adults we kind of forget that. But it's some of those strategies that I think we forget, and I always try and relate it back to myself when I'm trying to like make a bit of a point at school or something like that, with particularly routines, like knowing what's happening in a day or a particular task. Like, how often do you go to a meeting and if there's not an agenda set, or you don't know what time the meeting's going to end, or someone runs over, like your concentration is just gone like that. And I think we forget that for children it's the same, and even more important that they have this like similar, you know, strategies used throughout the day and in the classroom. Like those basics, just like letting them know how long an activity is going to last, when are they going to get a break, can they have a movement break, is really important.
I'm a massive advocate for speech and language, because, as I say, Alex has had it since he was 18 months, and for those listening, I mean, his play used to be dropping toys behind the television. When she first came into our environment, it was like, I can't do anything with him. I can't interact with him. I'm trying everything. I've got nieces and nephews. I've done this so many times, but I just can't interact with him. And he's gone from just posting things, that's what they call it, isn't it? Posting, to now we're sitting opposite each other and we're taking turns and we're playing. And that's all through interventions and learning his way of communicating. And I just think it's amazing. I think it's so important what you're doing.
Thanks. I'm glad it's been really useful for you and being able to build that rapport with Alex as well.
It's just getting into their world, isn't it, in a different way. And I think it's so important that, and like you say, encouraging others to, because it can look different and it can be difficult for family members and friends to kind of get into their world the way you do, because it's something that you're used to doing. And getting used to the fact, for Alex, he likes playing on his own a lot, and for us it was like he never used to play. Like now he's putting all of his toys in a car and he's zooming it round. Yes, he's on his own for 20 minutes, but this is great. Like this isn't posting things behind the TV. This is role playing. This is amazing for us, where you'll get comments like, oh, bless him, he's playing on his own. It's like, yeah, but look how happy he is. He's having a great time. Just because he's not interacting as much as other children, that is coming. But it's accepting that they do play differently, but they're still as happy.
Exactly. And I think that's the main thing, really, is just like supporting them to be happy and like enjoying what they're doing. And if that's their play looking really different, I think a lot of the time we want it to look similar to how we might want our play to, or how we expect a child's play to look. But actually,
it's the perception, isn't it? It's either what you've seen from other people, or
so that and potentially can make them unhappy. So just supporting them with their play and making those opportunities for them to play in their way, and for others to understand that actually it's not all bless them. It's like they're having a great time. We don't need to feel sad or sorry for them. They're expressing what they want to express and exploring the world in the way that they want to explore the world, and actually it's like great for them.
Yeah, exactly. Finally, we've been asked by many listeners whose children are not currently using spoken language, what are the signs that a non-speaking child is beginning to use spoken language? Obviously, it's something that's probably, very different for each child you're working with.
I think for any non-speaking, minimally speaking, or speaking child, that process can look quite different. And it might be that they begin to use some words, or they might use some kind of like unintelligible jargon for a little bit of time, or unintelligible strings of speech. And actually we're not sure kind of how that might develop. That might be their way of communicating. That's for us to then support them in that moment of how they can communicate and how they can express themselves even more. Sometimes they might get really into kind of like intonation and repeating things, and some of those kind of like strings of language as well, if we think they might begin to use language with kind of delayed echolalia. And we might kind of see their understanding really start to increase, and then their kind of communicative intent to increase as well. So with communication, them knowing that what they're trying to express in whatever way that is going to have an impact. Maybe facial expressions that they might use. If they do start to use like lots of phrases or lots of kind of like strings of language, then I would probably say, they're starting to kind of like build that language and commit that language to memory. And we're seeing that that's actually one of their preferred ways of communicating at the moment. So then we might build upon that.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much.
It's so fascinating. And it's so interesting how there's so much more to communication than just, spoken language, which is kind of, Max had a speech delay of about a year. And I suppose I was just really focused on, why is he not using words? Why is he not talking? But actually, I didn't really think so much about is he understanding what I'm saying? Is his understanding kind of increasing, and all these different things? It was only when Seona kind of, pointed that out to me that it made me think about it in a different way. I was just thinking he's not said 10 words by the time
Yeah.
he's 12 months or whatever the milestone
Yeah.
is. Yeah.
It can really get you down. And I think
Yeah.
for me, the main issue was around the no understanding and the non-speaking. That for me was the hardest bit, was that I couldn't get him to do something I asked of him verbally. So it was sort of learning other ways to try and help him, where now I've got a lot of understanding. It just makes the lack of speech so much easier. And it's hard to
Yeah.
explain that, but it really does. Like, I don't think about it anywhere near as much as I did before, because I can ask him to come and get his shoes on. I can ask him to get, his coat on, can say, right, let's go for a bath, and he runs upstairs. So when there's that understanding there, the speech doesn't become such a massive thing.
Yeah, it's definitely, we always think about it as kind of like an iceberg, and it's kind of what you see at the tip of the iceberg. And to be honest, speech is always up there. Speech is what you see and what other people, and it's how a lot of people communicate, even if we communicate using so many different forms and things. It's kind of, I think, as you say, it's the one thing people think about, whereas actually there's so much more going on, and so many other ways that you can communicate and express yourself, and so many other ways that people do communicate and express themselves, that actually once you start to see some of those other aspects, kind of like the understanding, or even just being able to kind of see, like, get into their world of play, or kind of see what they're enjoying, then it does help you to feel more connected, and to see them, to understand kind of how they're expressing themselves as well.
Seona, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us about, and giving us so many wonderful techniques. Really, really helpful. Thank you.
No worries. Lovely to be on.